Yo, it's Go, and welcome to the video. I'm going to go over the talent changes from Wrath Classic into Cataclysm, and while going over the changes, show you what I have planned for my spec for the pre-patch. Starting off in the top left, we have Nature's Grace, which has pretty much completely changed. So after you have spent 3 talent points, Nature's Grace will give you 15% spell haste after you cast Moonfire, Regrowth, or Insect Swarm, and that lasts for 15 seconds. This effect has a 1-minute cooldown, but when you gain Lunar or Solar Eclipse, the cooldown of Nature's Grace is instantly reset. Previously, Nature's Grace would proc a 20% casting speed increase for 3 seconds after any non-periodic spell would crit. The way we'll be using Nature's Grace in Cata is we'll be applying Insect Swarm first, which will proc Nature's Grace, and then Moonfire will benefit from it. And we'll be doing this right after we enter eclipses. Because there's such a thing called eclipse lag, we might try to cast a Wrath first in Solar or a Starfire first in Lunar before reapplying our dots. There's more nuance into the rotation with applying dots. The main takeaway from this talent is using Insect Swarm and then Moonfire, or Insect Swarm and then Sunfire. Starlight Wrath still reduces the cast time of Wrath and Starfire by half a second, but it only requires 3 points, whereas in Wrath it took 5. But since we only have 41 total talent points to spend instead of 71, it kind of makes sense. Next up, we have Nature's Majesty, which has changed a little bit. It now increases the critical strike chance with spells by 4%. And in Wrath, it only gave that 4% crit to a certain amount of spells, which was Wrath, Starfire, and Starfall. Genesis now increases the healing done by your periodic spells and by Swift Mend by 6%, and increases the duration of your Moonfire and Insect Swarm by 6 seconds. Back in Wrath, this just increased the damage and healing done by your periodic spell damage and healing effects by 5%. The first talent that I will skip over for the pre-patch is Moonglow. Moonglow, like Nature's Majesty, also changed to affect all of our damage and healing spells, whereas in Wrath, it was limited to a certain amount of spells. While leveling from 80 to 85, I might have some points in here because it would mean less downtime while questing and doing dungeons, but for pre-raid, I don't plan on having any points. Balance of Power is a big change. Now it increases your nature and arcane spell damage by 2% and increases our spell hit rating by an additional amount equal to 100% of any spirit gained from items or effects. So instead of having a flat 4% hit and some spell damage reduction, now in the pre-patch, some of that leather gear has spirit on it, so we'll get hit from that. And we should get at least 4% hit from spirit, if not more, without even trying. The spell damage portion of Balance of Power got switched over to Perseverance in the Resto tree, which I have seen some specs put points in there, but just something to keep in mind with how Balance of Power has changed. The next talent is a brand new talent, and that is Euphoria. With 2 points spent while we're not in an eclipse state, we will have a 24% chance to double the solar or lunar energy generated by Wrath or Starfire when they deal damage. So Starfire would grant 40 lunar energy instead of 20, and Wrath would grant 26 instead of 13. One thing to note though is the last part of that first paragraph is this effect cannot occur when you need less than 65 energy to reach one end of the eclipse bar. So as soon as you leave an eclipse is when you would have that extra chance for the double energy, but the last couple casts to get into an eclipse won't have this benefit. A great part of this talent as well is the very end, where when you reach a solar or lunar eclipse, you instantly are restored 16% of your total mana. So this is great to use while leveling up to even level 80, but it's a noticeable mana return once you enter an eclipse. Next up, we have Moonkin Form. This has changed quite a bit. There's no longer an improved Moonkin Form, and it now increases our arcane and nature spell damage by 10%, reduces all damage taken by 15%, and increases spell haste of all party and raid members by 5%. Before, Moonkin Form increased our armor contribution from items by 370%. Now that's kind of baseline. Currently on the PTR, I have the same exact gear from a copied character, and I'm sitting at 34.77% damage reduction with a little over 8,000 armor. And if I look at the same character currently in Wrath, I only have 3,400 armor, reducing damage by 18.57%. Now if I go into Moonkin Form, I have 15,600 armor, reducing physical damage by 50%. So the 34% plus the 15% damage reduction from Moonkin Form pretty much equals the same damage reduction. So in Wrath, Moonkin Form granted 5% crit, and we would have a mana return from our crits of 2% of our total mana. So now that portion of mana return got built into Euphoria, and the improved Moonkin Form gave us 3% haste, not quite the 5%, and we just totally lose out on that 5% crit aura. The big change is the last part of improved Moonkin Form, where we used to gain 30% of our spirit as additional spell damage. Typhoon works exactly the same way, no real change to Typhoon. Shooting Stars is a brand new talent because it affects a brand new spell, which is Star Surge. 2 points in Shooting Stars will give us a 4% chance when we deal damage with our Moonfire or Insect Swarm to instantly reset the cooldown of your Star Surge and reduce its cast time by 100%, and this proc lasts for 12 seconds. Without that proc, Star Surge has a 2-second base cast time with a 15-second cooldown. So Owlkin Frenzy still gives a 15% chance with 3 talent points spent to proc from incoming damage and increase our damage by 10% for 10 seconds. It also makes us become immune to spell pushback while we're casting our balance spells, but we no longer have the mana return that we used to get in Wrath. I'm used to seeing Owlkin Frenzy proc and knowing I'm getting some mana, so that's been a change I've been trying to adjust to on the beta. Gale Winds has not changed a single bit. It still has 2 talent points and increases our damage from Hurricane and Typhoon by 30% and increases the range of Clone by 4 yards. And we have a brand new interrupt called Solar Beam with a 1-minute cooldown, a 10-second duration, and you can use it on a target and it will shoot down a solar beam on that target, and anyone near the target will also be silenced. I'm not picking this up for ICC raids. I'll leave the interrupts to the melee. They're used to doing it anyways. Even while leveling, I've kind of skipped over this, but it is a very useful thing to have for dungeons. Dreamstate is still used to get us some of our mana back, but in a completely different way. Now, when we cast Innervate on ourselves with 2 points spent, we will regain an additional 30% of our total mana over its duration. Baseline Innervate will give us 20%, so this will bring us up to half of our total mana every time we use Innervate. Just like the other mana talent Moonglow, I don't plan on having this in ICC in the pre-patch, but while leveling, doing dungeons, it is fantastic. Dreamstate before used to just give us some mana per 5. We would regen mana equal to 10% of our intellect every 5 seconds, even while we were casting. Force of Nature didn't really change other than we get an extra couple yards to be able to drop them down. Still summons 3 treants that last for 30 seconds. Sunfire is just a fancy name for making Moonfire do nature damage instead of arcane damage. Once you enter into a solar eclipse, that's when that change will happen, and you will now use Sunfire instead of Moonfire. But all those previous talents that affect Moonfire will also apply to Sunfire. Earth and Moon's effect has been lowered a little bit. It only requires 1 talent point now instead of 3, but now our Wrath, Starfire, and Mushroom Detonate spells will apply Earth and Moon, which increases spell damage taken by the target by 8% for 15 seconds. In Wrath, the debuff used to give us 13%, so we lost 5% of that buff, but now it lasts for 3 seconds longer. And in Wrath, it also increased our spell damage by 6%, and now that is only down to 2%. The next 2 are new talents in Kata altogether, and that is Fungal Growth, which with 2 points spent puts a Fungal Growth underneath our treants when they die or wild mushrooms when they are detonated in an 8-yard range, which will slow all enemy targets by 50%, and it lasts for 20 seconds. So the treant effect is the only part that we'll be able to benefit from in the pre-patch, which is why I'm skipping over this talent, because having an unpredictable Fungal Growth drop from treants just doesn't sound worth it. At level 85, however, is pretty neat to use, especially while doing dungeons. You can drop 3 mushrooms around in a triangle, in a line, however you want to form them, and have a pretty big patch Fungal Growth on the ground, which is going to slow all those enemies. Lunar Shower is an interesting one. When we cast Moonfire, we will gain the Lunar Shower buff. And Lunar Shower increases the direct damage done by your Moonfire by 45% and reduces the mana cost by 30%. This effect stacks up to 3 times and lasts for 3 seconds. This means that Moonfire is pretty much a free cast that you can spam once this is stacked up to 3 times. If you don't continue to spam it, it quickly falls off. That 3 seconds goes by rather quickly. Also, while under the effect of Lunar Shower, Moonfire will generate solar energy and Sunfire will generate lunar energy. I plan on having this in the pre-patch. I'm not too sure how I feel about Moonfire and Sunfire generating energy. That means if we're in a solar eclipse and we use Sunfire, we'll be 8 energy closer to leaving solar eclipse, but we should only be casting one of these while we're in an eclipse anyways. So I don't think that really makes that much of a difference. The only time I can think of where it would is if we are trying to AoE and we are using our mushrooms because we're in a solar eclipse, and then we're sunfiring a couple targets, because I've heard that that's more damage than a hurricane. I'm sure that just depends on how many targets are in the pack. And then those sunfires are just going to slowly move us out of solar. So if it's a long AoE trash pack and we're trying to use our Sunfire, we'll be out of the eclipse before we know it. And lastly, we have Starfall. The only way that this talent really changed is it no longer does the splash damage, and it will only hit targets that we are in combat with, so it won't pull mobs that are in range that you haven't already attacked. So it's more of a 2-target cleave spell now, whereas it used to be a really solid AoE spell. And you really only want to try to use this in lunar eclipse, but if it comes off of cooldown and you're on your way into solar, then you'll probably still want to use it to get it back on cooldown. In the last 5 points, I plan on putting in the resto tree. 2 points in the top left with Blessing of the Grove will increase our healing done by rejuve by 4% and the direct damage of your Moonfire by 6%. Not a really big increase, but there aren't really any other talents that are going to increase our DPS that we can get right now other than Heart of the Wild, which I'll also have 3 points in. This will increase our intellect by 6%, which is going to give us spell power and a little bit of crit. And while in bear form, our stamina is increased, and cat form, our attack power is increased. If I take those 2 points back out of Fungal Growth, then this is the talent spec that I plan on having for raid in the pre-patch. But an honorable mention that we can't get to until we get to level 81 is Master Shapeshifter. It only requires 1 point now, but it still increases our spell damage by 4%. In order to get that though, you do need to have 2 points in Natural Shapeshifter, so when I level, I plan on just taking those 2 points out of Blessing of the Grove and switching them to Natural Shapeshifter. I lose that little bit of direct damage from Moonfire, but I gain an overall 4% spell damage, which to me just sounds worth it. So one of the spells in Wrath was Furor that would grant us extra intellect if we had points spent into it. So we could get 10% total intellect while in Moonkin form with the 5 points. Now that's over in the feral tree and it no longer gives us intellect, which if it did, it would make it worth it. Now it only gives us mana. If you're having mana issues while you're leveling up to 85 or even while you're at 85, you could spend some points there. Just thought I would mention that now. If you might be thinking, wait, that looks like Furor. Why aren't there any points spent for the pre-patch? With the talents out of the way, it's time to take a quick look at the glyphs. For prime glyphs, we have 4 major options. We have Insect Swarm first, increases the damage of your Insect Swarm by 30%. Glyph of Moonfire increases the periodic damage of your Moonfire ability by 20%. I think this will be one of the stronger ones. We have Glyph of Starfire that increases the duration of our Moonfire effect on the target by 3 seconds up to a maximum of 9 additional seconds. Only functions on the target with your most recently applied Moonfire. This glyph paired with the Moonfire glyph, just like in Wrath, is a pretty strong combo, so I plan on having both. And then for the third slot, it's going to be a toss-up between Insect Swarm and Glyph of Wrath, which Glyph of Wrath will increase the damage done by Wrath by 10%. So after looking at logs from the first week of raiding in the pre-patch, that might give a better idea of which glyph is better to have as the third option. So I plan on having Glyph of Moonfire, Starfire, and Wrath. Let me know what you plan on having for your prime glyphs. And for the major glyphs, I plan on having Glyph of Focus, which increases the damage done by Starfall by 10%, but decreases its radius by 50%. Glyph of Starfall, which reduces the cooldown of Starfall by 30 seconds, bringing it from 1.5 minutes down to 1 minute. And then the third one is really up to you. There's no other damage increase glyph, so I'm just going to pick Glyph of Rebirth in case I do need to res somebody in the raid. They'll have 100% health when they come back to life. It's far too often I res somebody and then they res into a mechanic and immediately die again. And then the minor glyphs, Glyph of Unburdened Rebirth, so we no longer have to have the reagent to use it. Glyph of Dash is really nice. If I ever fall behind the raid, this just helps it come off of cooldown faster. And then Glyph of Mark of the Wild, it doesn't cost that much mana anymore, so I don't see too much of a value in this. So I might just switch between having Glyph of Typhoon and not having it if I want to use the knockback. Once we're leveling from 80 to 85, if you're going to Vashir's Landing, the underwater zone, then having Glyph of Aquatic Form will come in pretty handy. Thought I would throw that in there really quick. So here is what I plan to have for all of my glyphs. And that's going to be it for this one. I'll try to have some more pre-patch informational videos coming very soon.